2 weeks after the bombs fell on Christmas Day, the loudest sound in northwest Nigeria is not victory. It is silence. Washington says the strikes were numerous and perfect. The president says ISIS was hit while killing innocent Christians. But on the ground, facts dissolve into questions. Which group was really targeted? How many fighters actually died? And why has so little been shared by the United States or by Nigeria about what happened next? I have covered American power for decades, and I've learned this lesson the hard way. When governments celebrate precision but avoid transparency, something deeper is at work. Airstrikes do not just destroy camps. They shape narratives. They send political messages. They choose symbols. If you want to understand modern warfare, you cannot stop at the explosion. You have to ask who benefits from the story being told and who disappears inside it. Stay with me, because before we judge success or failure, we must first understand the problem the world thinks it is solving. To understand this operation, we need to strip it of rhetoric and look at structure. The United States said it struck Islamic State fighters. Nigeria confirmed cooperation. But the group named afterward, Lakurawa, is not Boko Haram, not the insurgency most people know, and not the primary source of violence in the region. Lakurawa operates in a rural, underdeveloped corner of northwest Nigeria, near the Niger border. It extorts local communities. It enforces a harsh version of Islamic law. And yet, most killings there are carried out by criminal bandits, not jihadist cells. So why this target? Why now? And why frame it as a decisive blow against ISIS? These questions matter because military power is never just about firepower. It is about legitimacy. It is about narrative alignment between Washington's domestic politics and distant battlefields few voters can find on a map. When facts are thin, symbolism grows powerful. And when symbolism drives strategy, consequences rarely stay contained. To see how we arrived at this moment, we need to go backward into the history that made northwest Nigeria so vulnerable in the first place. To grasp that vulnerability, we have to understand how groups like Lakurawa emerge. Years ago, communities in northwest Nigeria were not looking for jihad. They were looking for protection. Banditry was spreading. The state was absent. Police were underfunded, distant, or distrusted. Into that vacuum stepped armed groups offering order. In roughly 2017, Lakurawa was invited by some local communities to defend them against bandits. At first, this looked like stability, but stability enforced by guns is never neutral. Over time, Lakurawa began asserting coercive authority. They extorted residents. They punished behavior they deemed un-Islamic. They imposed a rigid interpretation of Sharia using fear as governance. Researchers still debate who they really are. Some say they are linked to Islamic State's Sahel branch. Others report members pledging loyalty to Al-Qaeda. Even their name has no agreed meaning. What is clear is this: poverty, weak governance, and a vacuum of state power created fertile ground. And once violence becomes a substitute for government, it rarely stays contained. That failure sets the stage for the first rupture the moment the outside world intervenes. Then came the rupture. On Christmas Day, missiles cut through the silence of Sokoto State. The United States called it a coordinated strike on Islamic State camps. Initial assessments claimed multiple militants were killed, but almost immediately, certainty began to fracture. No confirmed casualty figures, no independent verification, only fragments of testimony whispered through journalists and researchers. One Lakurawa member told a researcher that nearly 100 fighters died in a forest camp. 200 more were said to be missing. Others reportedly fled toward Niger on motorcycles, 3 to a bike passing through villages that had never been part of the fight. Missile debris landed far from the target. Empty farmland, a town untouched by Lakurawa. Even a hotel hundreds of miles away where 3 workers were injured. This is how modern military crises unfold, not as clean victories, but as expanding ripples. Precision at the center, chaos at the edges. If you want to understand power today, don't just watch where the missile lands. Watch where the explanation stops. Because what followed was not clarity, but a deeper, more dangerous ambiguity. And to understand that ambiguity, we must examine the system beneath the strike itself. What we are really looking at here is not just a strike, but a system at work. The system rewards clarity in language, not in outcomes. Is, perfect strikes, Christmas Day. These are words designed to travel well across headlines, across social media, across domestic politics. But Lakurawa sits uncomfortably inside that narrative. It is poorly understood. Its links to global jihad are debated, and its violence, while real, is not the dominant threat in the region. So why target it? Because in counterterrorism, symbolism often substitutes for strategy. Hitting a jihadist group removes the burden of proof. You do not need to explain local complexity. You do not need to untangle banditry, governance, failure, or poverty. You simply declare a moral frame and act within it. 2 US officials suggested the strikes were a one-off, a demonstration, a message that American power was being used against those who kill Christians. This is how militarized foreign policy becomes performative. Force is deployed not primarily to resolve a conflict, but to sustain a story. And when stories drive strikes, the deeper problems remain untouched. That is why the consequences do not end with the explosion. They move outward toward people who had no role in the narrative at all. And that is where the second crisis begins. Not with another strike, but with what follows it. When fighters scatter, they do not disappear. They move, they adapt, they cross borders. After the airstrikes, reports suggested Lakurawa fighters were trying to flee into Niger. Motorcycles sped through villages. Borders already porous grew more fragile. This is the paradox of limited military intervention. You weaken a group in one place, and you may strengthen instability in another. Pressure here creates volatility there. Meanwhile, Nigeria's broader security crisis continued untouched. Bandit attacks went on. Gunmen killed dozens in Niger state. Students were abducted from a Catholic school hundreds at a time. The strike changed the map of attention, not the map of violence. For local security forces, this creates confusion. For civilians, fear. For the region, uncertainty. Because when power intervenes briefly and then looks away, it leaves behind something worse than failure. It leaves behind fragmentation. And that fragmentation lands hardest on people who never chose this fight but must live inside its consequences. If you live there, none of this feels abstract. You are not debating strategy or symbolism. You are calculating risk. You ask yourself simple questions. Do I stay or do I flee? Do I trust the state or the men with guns? Do I send my children to school tomorrow? You did not invite American missiles into your sky. You did not choose Lakurawa or bandits or jihadists. You chose survival, and yet every decision made far away lands on your doorstep. A strike meant to show strength creates fear. A campaign meant to protect Christians and Muslims alike deepens uncertainty for both. If you are listening to this and you live thousands of miles away, pause for a moment, because foreign policy is often sold as clean and distant, but its cost is intimate. It is felt in empty classrooms, in villages watching motorcycles disappear toward the border, in communities caught between armed groups and an absent state. If this matters to you, if you believe power should be accountable, then stay engaged. Ask harder questions. Share conversations like this one. Because the people most affected rarely control the story told about them. And that story is now spilling beyond Nigeria's borders. What happens in northwest Nigeria does not stay there. The Sahel today is one of the most fragile regions on earth. Weak borders, competing armed groups, states struggling to project authority beyond their capitals. When a group like Lakurawa is hit, the shockwave moves outward. Fighters drift across Niger. Weapons circulate. Alliances shift quietly. At the same time, global powers are recalibrating how and where they use force. The United States strikes in Nigeria, abducts a leader in Venezuela, signals interest in Greenland. These are not isolated moves. They form a pattern of unpredictability. For allies, this creates anxiety. For rivals, opportunity. For fragile states, pressure. Counterterrorism actions that lack clarity weaken international trust. They blur the line between cooperation and coercion, and they risk turning local conflicts into nodes of global competition. This is how peripheral places become central, without ever being understood. A rural forest camp becomes part of a worldwide narrative about power, faith, and force. And when geopolitics moves faster than governance, instability multiplies. The real question, then, is not what happened last Christmas. It is what comes next and whether the world has learned anything at all. Looking ahead, there are three possible futures, and none of them are guaranteed. The first is the optimistic one. Nigeria treats this moment as a warning. Security operations are paired with governance. Schools reopen safely. Local policing returns. The vacuum begins to close. Armed groups lose their appeal because the state finally shows up. The second future is more likely. The strikes fade from headlines. Lakurawa fragments but survives. Banditry continues. Foreign partners intervene occasionally, loudly, briefly, and then move on. Violence becomes normalized, background noise. Then there is the third path, the dangerous one. Symbolic strikes replace strategy entirely. Armed groups mutate and regionalize. Borders erode further. Each intervention creates the justification for the next. History teaches us something uncomfortable. Force without follow-through rarely solves structural problems. It rearranges them. The fate of Northwest Nigeria will not be decided by a single strike or a single president. It will be decided by whether power is matched with patience and action with accountability. And that brings us to the final insight, what this moment reveals about how the world now uses power. This is the paradox of our age. Power is faster than understanding. Weapons move quicker than institutions. And narratives travel further than facts. What happened in Northwest Nigeria was not just a military event. It was a mirror. It reflected how modern power prefers action over explanation and symbolism over solutions. Airstrikes can kill fighters. They cannot rebuild trust. They cannot replace governance. They cannot fill the vacuum that allowed groups like Lakurawa to exist in the first place. I have seen this pattern across continents. When force becomes performative, problems do not disappear. They migrate. They deepen. They wait. The real question is not whether the strikes were perfect. It is whether they were honest about their goals, their limits, and their consequences. If you care about foreign policy that actually works, do not settle for headlines. Demand context, demand follow-through, demand accountability, and if you want to keep exploring how power, politics, and people collide in today's world, stay with me. Share this conversation and join the next one, because understanding is not passive. It is the first act of responsibility.